As neighbors, the U.S. and Mexico have a long and intertwined history, one mostly characterized by cooperation, but that has seen many highs and lows. Last week certainly brought a new low to the relationship, with the Mexican President López Obrador, known colloquially as AMLO, declaring a pause, his words, in relations with the U.S. Embassy. This announcement came after months of simmering tensions between the two countries. Now, here to discuss this incident, and more importantly, the state of U.S.-Mexico relations, is Tony Payan, director of the Baker Institute Center for the United States and Mexico. Tony's research focuses largely on border studies, including cross-border flows of people and contraband, both legal and illegal, and border governance. His work also examines problems affecting the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I'm David Satterfield, director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Tony, thank you for joining me again today, and I'll lead off with, and we've got lots of questions, what prompted AMLO to pause or freeze relations with the U.S. or whatever relations with the U.S. Embassy may mean? And what will this look like in practice?
Right. I think I'll start by the second question. It means absolutely nothing. I mean, those who have been in the diplomatic world know that either you have relations or not, you communicate or not. Pause per se doesn't exist. So the president has come up with a word that will allow him to push back criticism coming from the embassy and the ambassador, Mr. Ken Salazar, and from the United States. But it means very little in terms of actual communication and pushback from the U.S. and relations with the United States. So it's an invention by the president.
But Tony, what prompted this? Ambassador Salazar was not regarded previously as someone who had a difficult relationship with AMLO. Quite the opposite. What happened?
Well, I think one of the things is that probably Ambassador Ken Salazar was finally asked by Washington to push back against some of the reforms that Mr. López Obrador intends to push through in September. The new Congress took office on September 1st, and the new president takes office on October 1st.
And what's unique about that new Congress?
Well, Morena, which got 54% of the vote, managed in a formula, very complicated formula, prompted by the coalitions and the single parties and the overrepresentation allowed in the Constitution, to get 75% of the vote, the representation in Congress, which means that for the first time in his nearly 6 years of office, Mr. López Obrador is going to have an absolute majority in the lower house to push all the constitutional reforms that he's been dreaming of for all these years. And that means a lot of uncertainty. It means that the judicial system is going to be weakened considerably in Mexico. It means that many of the independent regulatory commissions are going to be wiped out. A lot of power is going to be concentrated in the executive. So the regime, the actual structure of the Mexican government will be substantially changed. That, of course, introduces a lot of uncertainty in the economic and investment relationship, the commercial relationship between the two countries. And I think Salazar was finally asked to speak out. Mr. López Obrador is well known for being thin-skinned. He didn't like it. He doesn't like criticism from anybody. And I think at that point, he decided to put the ambassador on pause, whatever that means, obviously.
Tony, help us to understand López Obrador as an ideologue, a populist, a demagogue, all three. How does he view himself?
Like any populist in Latin America, they think that they're implementing a radical democracy, direct democracy, that they want the people, so to speak, not citizens, not individuals, not people making decisions on a rational basis in a participatory way, in a deliberative way, but rather the people. They like to talk about the people. And I think he sees himself as that kind of leader. I think he's a throwback to the mid-century. I think he's an individual who really believes that the executive ought to be the head of government, and that the legislative branch, Congress, on the one hand, and the judiciary on the other hand ought to be instruments of the executive. He really believes in centralizing power. He really believes in a statist, state-led economic model, which I think it's absurd and nearly unsustainable. It's been proven in the 20th century to have some serious limits, and I think the next president will see those limits. So I think he's an old guy. He really never evolved in his thinking from when he was a young activist to burning oil wells in Tabasco, his native state, and being formed in the old pre-political culture of centralization, strong men, and strong power in the executive. And I think he really believes that that's the ideal model for Mexico, and he wants to go back to that time.
He may want to go back to that time, but on October 1st, less than a month from now, a new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, takes office. Before we talk about the AMLO-Sheinbaum relationship, let's talk about Claudia Sheinbaum. What is her identity politically?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's hard to tell because throughout the campaign, she pretty much parroted everything the president said. She didn't say anything different than the positions of the president himself. He trained her, he formed her, he informed her, he handpicked her, and he pushed to get her elected. So she has this staunch loyalty to Mr. López Obrador. She has even imitated his accent, which is a very kind of Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, Tabasco accent, different than other accents. And she seems to kind of mimetize herself in that sense. And she supports all the reforms that they're about to pass in the month of September. So we don't know who the real Claudia Sheinbaum is. She hasn't shown up. And so far, I think we're looking at a continuation and a lot of loyalty to Mr. López Obrador.
We've talked before about the historical precedent for former presidents, however powerful, having to cede authority to their successors at the price of exile. What's going to happen this time?
Yeah, some Mexican analysts and even some optimists would say that this is going to happen again. What essentially happened in the 1930s when then President Calles handpicked his successor, Mr. Cárdenas, and then tried to govern through him. And then Cárdenas eventually asserted himself, gave Mr. Calles a plane ticket and sent him to San Diego, where he eventually died and became truly the president. And since then, even Salinas, back in 94, who was a very strong president, was exiled to Ireland. And the way that President Cedillo did it at that time is by jailing his brother, Raúl Salinas. So that was a shot across the bow and saying, you got to go. It's my turn. Some folks say that this is exactly what's going to happen. It may take her a year and a half. I'm not convinced. I think he picked her right because she is very pliable to his will.
And the party and the Congress, where does their loyalty lie?
I would say that Morena, the president's party with its supermajority, is loyal to him, not to her. I think she's not as charismatic, she's not as interesting, and she's not the founder of the political party. So their loyalty is to him. So my guess is that if he retires to his ranch in Tabasco, his native state, and he instructs the political party to act in a certain way that she doesn't like, they're going to follow him, not her. That's going to be a big issue for her because at some point she's going to have to claim the loyalty of the party and get them to follow her leadership. And I'm not sure that she's going to be able to. As long as he's alive, she's not going to be able to do that. And very important, he essentially created a sword of Damocles that hangs over her head. They changed the Constitution a bit ago to have a recall election if needed. So he can always have that. And down the line, 2-3 years into her term, if he doesn't like it, he can certainly organize a recall election. His party can organize a recall election, and then we'll be facing new political turmoil.
Can he come back into office under the Mexican Constitution?
Not right now. Evidently, with this supermajority, he could. They could change the Constitution, and he could run again. It's not the Mexican tradition. Effective suffrage, no re-election. And it's been like that since the Mexican Revolution for 100 years.
So, Tony, whether it is López Obrador or Sheinbaum, what's the state of the treasury, of the resources, fiscal resources of the Mexican state right now?
Yeah, the neoliberal governments, so hated by Mr. López Obrador, left billions and billions and billions of dollars in savings, and they left a solid growth, not great, 2 to 2.5% per annum, So a good tax base and lots of foreign investment coming in. The result of Mr. López Obrador's policy decisions have been that he burned through all that money in cash transfers, in the creation of new liabilities for pensions for the elderly, cash transfers for single mothers, for youth that are not working or studying, and all kinds of programs that he created. He burned through all that money. Growth has been meager. 0.9% per annum average, which is not enough to create a middle class in Mexico. And he's opened a 6% budget deficit that's important, and she's going to have to deal with that. And I think new foreign direct investment has dried out. It was not even $1 billion January through September of this year. That's really nothing. And I think that all the taxes in arrears have been paid off because they were aggressively collecting that. And now they're borrowing in the international markets. And that's where I think the danger is, that now you begin to borrow just to cover created liabilities. And that's dangerous.
Now, Tony, to the extent that a vibrant Mexican economy able to create sustainable, real living wage jobs is important not just for Mexico and its own stability and prosperity, but as a brake on Mexican cross-border migration as opposed to third country migration, which is a different story. Where's the economy stand in terms of job creation, whether in the maquiladoras or in the Mexican industry as a whole, and hydrocarbons, which everyone around the world, except it seems Mexico, look at as a significant sector to generate income? What's going on?
Yeah, I think the economy is not in very good shape. Growth, as I said, has been very low, much lower than the much maligned neoliberal governments. So he's not been able to deliver on that. The latest numbers in the Social Security roster, which kind of keeps track of the formal employment creation, shows that the country is already hemorrhaging formal jobs. A huge segment, over 50% of workers in the country are in the informal sector, so they don't pay taxes. The country is receiving $65 billion in remittances, which is kind of maintaining some of the consumption in the country, but that's a subsidy equivalent to somewhere between 3.5 to 4% of the overall GDP. That's coming from the United States, from Mexican migrants. So in the future, I think if this continues and there's no foreign direct investment, given the business uncertainty in the environment, many more Mexicans will choose to migrate to the United States. This is where I think the U.S. ought to be paying attention to what's going on in Mexico, because at the end of the day, that will end up on this side of the Rio Grande.
And hydrocarbons?
Yes, the energy sector. Mexico is absent now on most of the international stage, dealing with climate change, with energy transition. It's not investing in R&D at all. Instead, Mr. López Obrador, again, being a creature of the mid-20th century, is a big believer in oil. It's all about oil. We also have to remember that this huge oil deposit, Cantarell, is off the coast of Campeche and Tabasco. So he grew up with an oil culture. That's his mind, and he has not been able to transcend that. He doesn't believe in renewable energies. He's slowed down or stopped nearly all investment in solar energy, wind energy. He really believes that the future is oil and that Mexico has to figure out how to revive the oil industry, the great subsidizer of the American economy back in the 70s and 80s. He really believes in that model. But at the end of the day, I think it's not going to work. Most of the world is moving on, even as Mexico is sort of stepping back.
And he has been quite closed in a sort of 1950s mentality to opening Mexico's hydrocarbon sector to the kind of foreign investment, technical support, which could help it. There's a big share of the Permian Basin that is in Mexico.
Yeah, the interesting thing here is, even though his promise was to create a new renaissance of the oil industry, Mexico, when he took office, was producing about 1.65 million barrels of oil a day. Today is about 1.5 million. So even in that, he has not delivered. And then when it comes to natural gas, Mexico depends on Texas for about 65-70% of all its gas, which means the Mexican manufacturing industry And the Mexican electricity production industry, the generation of electricity, depends entirely on imports of natural gas from Texas. That's good for Texas. Obviously, the market is right next door. You don't have to spend a lot in transportation. But it's not good for Mexico in the sense that it'll continue to be heavily dependent on Texas. In some ways, I think Mr. López Obrador continues to be dependent on American investment, American natural gas, access to remittances from the migrants, access to the U.S. consumer market through the USMCA. And in a different way, he's really a nationalist anti-American, because in Mexico, being a nationalist is being anti-American. And he's not that open about that, but he's very sensitive to American criticism. So he's kind of a paradoxical figure in that sense.
Or Mexico, so close to the U.S., so far from heaven. Now, what does all of this mean, though, for Sheinbaum, AMLO? How's their relationship, her relationship, if she leads, going to change, stay the same, grow worse, grow better with respect to the United States?
The hope, most analysts and certainly investors and the business community in Mexico, I think with some degree of delusion, believe that she's a scientist, that she's more rational, she's less nationalistic, and that she might, in the end, recalibrate Mexican policy to be more aligned with Mexico's dependence on the U.S. investment markets and labor markets and remittances and such. I'm not convinced. I think she has shown no degree of independence so far, unless she's really reserving that card, very close to her vest, and at some point she's going to do something to neutralize Mr. López Obrador. Mr. López Obrador's sons have been some of the most corrupt actors, enriching themselves immensely under his administration, denied by him, and that makes him vulnerable, which means that all she has to do is do exactly what Cedillo did with Salinas. Get one of those sons, put him in jail, and then say, go quietly into that good night, so to speak, and it's my turn, and then she can correct the direction the country is going. I'm not sure. I think I will hold my judgment on that. There's one thing that I think our listeners ought to know. The Senate, the president, and Morena lack a supermajority needed to change the Constitution in the Senate by one vote. It was 3. And then 2 of the now extinct PRD party switched to Morena. So they got 2 out of those 3. Now there's only 1. All these constitutional changes that they're passing right now that will be so deep in Mexican history and really take Mexico in a completely different direction are hanging by a thread, by one vote in the Senate. If the opposition sticks together between now and September 30th and they vote no solidly, they can't lose one single vote, there's hope. But I mean, it is truly a scenario hanging by a thread.
So, looking at what Sheinbaum is going to inherit, the time bombs, fiscal, hydrocarbon policy, ability to sustain AMLO's extraordinary social largesse.
Security.
And security. Talk a little bit about that last time bomb, security.
Yeah. Well, Mr. López Obrador, I think pushing back against the Mérida Initiative, which is this framework the U.S. and Mexico agreed to back in 2007, and which was in place through 2022, and eventually replaced by something that came to be known as the Bicentennial Agreement, which to me was López Obrador's very able way to distract the United States on security and tamp down all cooperation, really neutralize the DEA and the FBI and the American embassy in Mexico.
What did he do?
Essentially, he promised that if the U.S. needed that cooperation on immigration, then they couldn't have any other thing. And so by sectioning off the agenda into different items and then having the Trump and then the Biden administration dependent on Mexico to control immigration at the border, then they essentially gave him a pass on democracy, on trade, on energy, and all kinds of other issues, including security, which is vital for the United States. So Mr. López Obrador knew exactly how to corner Washington and how to get them to leave him alone. This is why I think he was so sensitive now that Mr. Salazar finally spoke out.
And what is the situation with respect to organized crime, gangs in Mexico?
It is estimated by some of the experts, I tend to agree with them, that about 40% of the country is now controlled by organized crime. There are entire states. Chiapas has a civil war between gangs and criminal groups. People are being displaced, even into Guatemala. There's now a flow of refugees into Guatemala from Mexico. Mexican citizens who are now refugees of this civil war among organized criminal groups in Chiapas, and then states like Guerrero, who are practically co-opted by organized crime. The government is just a shadow, essentially. Then you got states like Michoacan, where you have the lime industry and the avocado industry that are completely taxed by organized crime. We pay that in the United States because when you go to the grocery store here and you buy an avocado and you pay $1.50, it's very likely that 10 to 20% of the price is actually a tax imposed by organized crime in Mexico. And you got water, and you got mining, and you got felling of the forests, and you got chicken production, and you got extortion in all kinds of businesses. But Mr. López Obrador, I think, believes that crime is not a problem, and he's allowed crime in Mexico to flourish, these groups to get very powerful, and I think it's probably one of the most serious challenges that Sheinbaum is going to have to try to restore some sanity to Mexico's public safety and security policy.
Did he strike deals with organized crime, or was he simply passive?
Well, I mean, this is a very good question because I think he certainly had some kind of agreement with the Sinaloa cartel. He visited El Chapo Guzman's mother. He's been to Badiraguato, which is essentially the cradle of Sinaloa's organized crime and the Sinaloa cartel. Several times, he seems to have an affinity to visit this place. He has implemented a policy known as abrazos no balazos, hugs not bullets, towards organized crime. He has asked the military and the National Guard, when they're close to a confrontation with criminal organizations, to back out and move away. And so he doesn't allow them to confront organized crime. And the story is that they probably helped him get elected. They probably helped him mobilize people to the polls. They intimidated poll workers and opposition figures during the election in several states. And obviously, there's also the capture of Mayo Zambada. That's really key.
Yes. How much impact did that have on the relationship, the bilateral relationship?
Quite a lot. In fact, it's puzzling that Mr. López Obrador might see somebody like Mayo Zambada captured. This is one of the most important capos in Mexico, sought by the United States for 3 to 4 decades. And then he is, in this extraordinary rendition, taken out of Mexico into the United States. Mr. López Obrador is very upset. He's very upset with the United States. He's demanded explanations. He certainly filed protests at the State Department to no avail. They're not going to let him know how this happened and what deal it was. I think it was probably a deal with the Guzman family, maybe El Chapo and the other son, to turn him over. But they conducted this operation in kind of a cooperation deal between the Sinaloa cartel leaders and the U.S. government, but they didn't tell Mr. López Obrador, because when you give information to the Mexican government, they tend to leak it out to organized criminals, and then they're ready to go. So I think Mayo Zambada has valuable information, and I think that he's already said that in Sinaloa, at least, Morena is an active collaborator of organized crime, that the governor himself was present when he was caught, and when the former president of the state university was killed in front of him, and then he was flown into New Mexico. So this is really close. This is when the fire is real close, and there's a lot of smoke coming out, so you know that there's something there. But, Mr. López Obrador, in fact, filed a lawsuit, a prosecutorial action, against Joaquin Guzman López, who turned El Mayo Zambada into the U.S. authorities for treason. He believes that he's having caught Mayo Zambada and having turned him over to U.S. authorities is betraying the country. And so to me, that's sort of odd that a president would say that this is treason to the homeland.
Turning back to the relationship in the broadest sense, 2025 is going to be a big year because there is a review of the trade agreement. Tell us a bit about what has to happen and what potential options are if there's a Harris administration, if there's a Trump administration?
I think the agreement, as mandated by clause that the Trump administration asked to be placed in the agreement, is that by July 1st, 2026, the agreement expires unless the parties agree that it's working and it should continue another 10 years. I think the Trump administration, some say, is committed to it because it's kind of their baby. They negotiated it, so they have no reason to end it. I think the Harris administration, if it happens, might also leave it alone for now. There's too many other issues to deal with, so they may leave it alone. But there's a lot of leverage left on the table if the U.S., Washington specifically, doesn't make some serious demands in 2025. They can't push too much because obviously Mexico is a strategic partner for North American competitiveness globally against China. So Mexico has got to be on this side. It's a difficult partner, keeps kicking and screaming, but it's important on a global scale for the United States and for North America. But it's a leverage that it should not be left on the table. And I think the USMCA is a good opportunity to sort of tell Mexico, this is what we demand that be placed in the agreement, and these are the changes that you have to make to the system. This is what happened in 92, 93, when they negotiated NAFTA. They said, we're happy to open the market, we're happy to enter into this agreement, but we demand these changes. And eventually, the Mexican Congress, under the Salinas administration, had to make some constitutional changes and some legal changes to accommodate some of the U.S. demands. I think it's another opportunity to do just that.
And Tony, just a word for our listeners. What is the magnitude of U.S.-Mexico bilateral trade, import-export?
Yeah, it's enormous. $800 billion a year, $1.6 trillion over 2 years. It's enormous. The interesting thing about it is about half of it is end consumer trade, stuff that we directly buy to consume. TVs, computers, medical equipment, avocados, tomatoes, you name it, automobiles, auto parts, and things like that. And about half of it is intra-firm trade, which means companies selling to each other, buying from themselves and their subsidiaries, for example, parts, and then sending the parts to Mexico to complete the vehicle and then exporting the vehicle. The important part of the 50% or so of intra-firm trade is that it tells you how integrated the production chains are. And that involves Canada too, because some of those things, they go into parts go into Mexico, they get assembled, they come into the U.S., they get reassembled and become more sophisticated, sent back to Mexico, then sent to Montreal or in Canada somewhere to be finished, and then back to the U.S. So it's very integrated. This is what I mean by Mexico makes the U.S. more competitive. It's just that it's right now a kind of a reluctant partner. So we got to figure out a way to get Mexico to be a more acquiescent partner and to understand that building a better North America is good for all three.
And on that note, Tony, I'm going to raise one final issue for you, which can be a topic for a future Baker briefing. The New York Times, very long article on how NAFTA transformed U.S. society and the U.S. economy. Essentially, the article would say it gutted the industrial United States. Masterlock Company moved its business to Mexico. It's closed after a very long, nearly century of operation, as one anecdotal example. What do you think about NAFTA?
Well, a few years ago, Russell Green, who was here at the Baker Institute, I think he's now at the World Bank, and I wrote a paper. Was NAFTA good for the United States? That was a paper, that was about a 5-6-year-old paper, and we concluded that it really made about a 0.5% GDP difference on the U.S. economy. So it's not that big. I mean, the U.S. is a $25 trillion economy, and you have $800 billion of trade with Mexico, of which 400 is really firms exchanging goods. So at the end of the day, when it comes to the consumer market itself, it's trade of $400 billion. In some sense, it's a small percentage of the U.S. economy. It's much larger for Mexico, because Mexico depends, 50% of its exports are to the U.S., and 40% of its economy is export-oriented. So clearly it depends a lot more on the U.S. But I think we have to be careful when we examine that, because one thing is to say, well, chairs, tables, TVs are now made in Mexico and their jobs lost in the United States. But at the same time, because they're made less expensively, I would say, in Mexico than we consumers in the United States can acquire that TV for 20, 30, 40% less in price. So it benefits us in one way. Maybe it's not as obvious because you buy the TV, you buy the medical equipment, you buy what you need, and you pay the price, but you don't realize that it's less expensive precisely because it was made in Mexico, even if a job was lost in the United States. So a job was lost, but the consumer gains. And so it's a really complicated calculation.
Thank you. For more on key policy issues facing Mexico, including the relationship with the United States, I encourage our listeners to read our Mexico Country Outlook Report for 2024, published earlier this year. Now, that report can be accessed at bakerinstitute.org/MCO, and it's also linked in our show notes. The Center for the United States and Mexico publishes this report each year to unpack the major policy issues facing Mexico and the U.S. in the year ahead. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel and Victoria Jupp, with support from Grayson Beaubien. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.